It's my nerd world, and welcome to it, a Star Wars show. On this week's episode, is The Mandalorian going Game of Thrones? Did they just deliver the best dogfight in Star Wars streaming live action yet? I'll share with you my thoughts on the Bad Batch, and we have some listener feedback to dive into this week as well. Remember, if you want to support my nerd world, check out the science fiction space opera series EMBARK, where you can follow a ragtag squadron of pilots and one reluctant hero on a journey of survival from Earth to the far reaches of space as they fight for humanity's future among the stars. Available under EMBARK Jon Justice on Amazon.com or mynerdworld.net.
Nothing will stand in our way.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
I will finish what you started.
Who are you? I'm no one.
There are stories about what happened.
It's true. All of it.
The Force. It's calling to you.
My nerd world.
Just let it in.
As a Star Wars fan who loves his spaceships and space battles, even though it was a in-atmosphere fight, the Episode 3 of Season 3 of The Mandalorian delivered in that opening segment in a big, big way for this Star Wars fan. My name is Jon Justice. I'm your host here on My Nerd World, a Star Wars show. Glad you are with another episode. So, going to talk a bit about The Mandalorian, and could they be setting up for something Game of Thrones-esque? I'm going to use that loosely. It's the best example that I could give as it relates to Bo-Katan and what happened in this episode. Of course, there's going to be a lot of spoilers, so just be aware of that. Plus, we'll talk a little bit of Bad Batch, get to your listener feedback as well. Before we do all that, though, there's an interesting article from The Wrap as it relates to the potential of a big event happening around the live-action shows that are in this timeline The Mandalorian is in. So, let's go ahead and start off with this article, an interview with Dave Filoni from The Wrap.
This is not going to go the way you think.
And I will say up front that I'm really pleased with the Star Wars that we're getting right now. And Wednesdays have become special in the Justice household because we watch the latest episodes of The Mandalorian and The Bad Batch back to back, and they've both just been delivering. This week's Bad Batch episode was a little what you would call on the filler side, even though we might be building towards something. And I'll talk about that when we get later on into the show. But again, let's start here. The Wrap spoke to Dave Filoni, who is one of the showrunners. Of course, he worked on Clone Wars, protege of George Lucas, working now with Jon Favreau on The Mandalorian. He's also doing Ahsoka. He spoke with The Wrap about the new season of The Mandalorian, his interest in turning his animated characters into live-action favorites, and whether or not the series and Star Wars spin-offs like Ahsoka will actually culminate in a big event, as was teased by Kathleen Kennedy. So I'm going to move past the turning the animated characters into live-action favorites and focus on those two other questions there about the latest season of The Mandalorian and this possibility of a big event taking place. So the first question they asked of Dave Filoni was, going into The Mandalorian Season 3, what were the key objectives for you? And he said, the story, by definition, is The Mandalorian, and it speaks to that part of the Star Wars saga that we're now telling specifically about Din Djarin and Grogu, but they've pulled into their orbit many other Mandalorian characters, namely Katie Sackhoff's Bo-Katan. You have the armor. And I think that it starts to raise a lot of questions about the way, and what is the way, and when they speak vaguely about their home planet of Mandalore, which was basically lost, really destroyed in the war with the Empire, is there any chance of rectifying that, reclaiming that? And what does that mean for our lead character, Mando? What does that mean for Grogu, now that Grogu's chosen to be with the Mando instead of following Luke on the path of the Jedi? What are these little signs and tea leaves saying to us in our Star Wars galaxy? Jon is the one that brought the idea to Lucasfilm, and I've been shepherding it with him. That would be The Mandalorian. He would disagree with this, but I always see it as his story, and I'm helping to aid him through as George guided me in the Clone Wars. And I think that he's done an amazing job. He always does with the writing and with his ideas. I've mentioned quite a bit on the show how I've missed the mythology aspect of Star Wars and really likened that towards the Force, the films, the sequel trilogy, and the fact that I've just been missing that aspect of it. We didn't really get a ton of that in Obi-Wan Kenobi, certainly not hardly at all in the Book of Boba Fett. What I love, and what I've mentioned over the course of these past few episodes with the launch of Season 3, is that we're bringing the mythology aspect back into Star Wars again, and what they're telling with the story of Din Djarin and now Bo-Katan, with the Darksaber, the culture, again, the mythology, and more importantly and specifically the belief, it's really hitting all the right notes for me as a fan. And I'm really appreciating the fact that we're once again in popular culture seeing a story being told and characters, strong characters, who are the focal point of these shows, who actually do have a belief beyond themselves. I don't want to get too far off of Star Wars here, but given the world that we live in currently, and it's something that I can absolutely not avoid because of my full-time job Monday through Friday of hosting a weekly news talk radio show, but it is just refreshing to see in, again, popular culture, a storyline where the characters are embracing this idea of it's not all about them. They have something beyond them that's more important, that they're loyal to. And this speaks to both Bo-Katan and what we're about to see potentially her go through, depending on what her motivations are, but certainly as it relates to Din Djarin and his motivation in these first opening episodes after taking off his helmet, becoming an apostate, and how important it was for him to get back into the Mandalorian way, to be accepted back into the covenant, into the coven, whichever way you want to go and word that. I'll talk a little bit more about this coming up, but this is a part of the Mandalorian that I've just been really enjoying from the aspect of, again, don't want to go too deep on it, but in the current world that we live in, to see a character that actually is able to look beyond himself and isn't so self-centered and realizes there's something more important than he is. It's just incredibly refreshing, and it's what made Star Wars so special in the first place. Getting back to the Wrap article, they asked, Kathleen Kennedy said in 2020 that the series would culminate in a climactic story event. But more recently, Jon has said The Mandalorian could go on forever. Are you building towards a climactic story event, or has that been put aside? Dave Filoni answered, well, from a certain point of view, it could build to a climactic thing, and The Mandalorian could still go on. It's not necessarily either or, is it? It's interesting. It's an interesting way to think about it. I tend to think that we've been working on The Mandalorian and then writing Ahsoka, and then Jon Watts came in with the Skeleton Crew, and there is an entire time period that is post-Return of the Jedi. And I look at that time period, which before The Force Awakens is around 30 years of time. When you look at the original trilogy, it's a much less significant amount of time that those three movies take place in. And so what I like is that we're really building very slowly an ecosystem of characters and politics and events in the post-Return of the Jedi time period. And that may or may not expand in a bigger way as we add more shows to it and add more characters to it. The good thing is that we're all talking creatively together about where these stories are going. I love the whiteboards, and the whiteboard and I whiteboard everything and have timelines. They always start back with The Phantom Menace, and they always go out to The Rise of Skywalker. I have all these slots in between and where everybody is doing everything, so I can look at it all and commiserate with Kathy on what's going on here, what's going on there. It's very fun. And I think that the reality of there being a big event in this time period is, well, very real, is all I will say to that. But yes, Jon and I wanted to keep making the Mandalorian stories as long as he does not get bumped off in said Titanic event. Then they, I suppose, could continue. There doesn't seem to be any lack of interest for Grogu and the Mandalorian, that's for sure. And we'll get into this when I talk a little bit more about what happened in this week's Mandalorian episode. But to his point, and I'll just go ahead and bring this up now, word is that the pirate crew that we saw the Mandalorian face off in the first episode that had the pirate ship and they had the space dogfight, that pirate crew and that green-looking dude, and I can't remember what his name was, are actually potentially going to be the villains in the Skeleton Crew show, which is supposed to be a show based around the era that we're in right now with The Mandalorian, focusing on a group of kids. Jude Law stars in this show. It's supposed to be more in line with the old 1980s Emblem movies, along the lines of like Goonies, and we're hearing that the pirates that we saw in The Mandalorian may have been our first preview of the antagonist that we will see in the Skeleton Crew. So I want to talk a little bit about the time frame and how this episode, while the middle portion of the episode was, a little dull, I feel that it was incredibly necessary for the story they're trying to tell, and that it was a smart move in bookending the episode the way that they did for this week's Mandalorian. However, there are some very interesting little bits here and there that I appreciated that I want to talk about. Now, before we do that, I want to go and talk a little bit about rumors and speculation, especially since we're getting very close to Star Wars Celebration in London here in a couple weeks, where we're going to get movie announcements, and I have a rather interesting theory to present to you.
We have a spark that'll light the fire that'll burn the First Order down.
Now, I've talked a lot on the show about the potential for a movie post The Rise of Skywalker, and that at Star Wars Celebration, we should be getting an idea of what movies will be coming out, whether it's Taika Waititi's movie, whether it's this Damon Lindelof movie that we've talked about quite a bit that continues to be rumored on. Here's my speculation, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the announcement that we are going to get at Star Wars Celebration is going to be for a movie set after The Rise of Skywalker, and it will be Star Wars Episode 10. Now, I speculate on this because whenever we have had this much distance and this much time pass between Star Wars films, now granted, okay, there's rationale for this based off of we only had Star Wars movies within the Skywalker saga, the episode saga films, until Disney went and took over Lucasfilm, and then we ended up getting Solo and Rogue One. So, that being said, anytime we've gone this amount of time without a theatrical release, the next film has always been episode blank, whether it was moving forward in the timeline, whether it was going back in the timeline with The Phantom Menace, or whether it was jumping again forward in the timeline and going back to Episode 7 with The Force Awakens. Within the fandom, it may not make much sense. Within the fandom, people will go, no, they want to get away from the Skywalker saga. Kathleen Kennedy said we want to get away from the Skywalker saga. And you can still do that and have it be Episode 10. From a marketing standpoint, it makes the most sense to me that if you are going to be pulling back on your projects, which Bob Iger, who took over for Bob Chapek after Bob Iger stepped down, has said that they're going to be looking more at quality, not quantity. And we now have had, eight? So let's see, let me do the math here. You'll be looking at 6 years since the release of Star Wars Episode 9. Now, for the fans, you listening to this podcast, again, you're going to go, nope, they're going to get away from it. They wouldn't do an Episode 10. But you tell me, what is going to make the biggest impact and announcement beyond the fandom as listening to podcasts and the general public than an announcement of Star Wars Episode 10? If you want to make the argument that, well, the sequel trilogy was controversial, okay, it was. But that audience that saw the sequel trilogy, there's a whole bunch of those individuals that were younger when they saw the sequel trilogy, did not go down the rabbit holes of The Last Jedi and the controversies around it and everything that's been said negative about The Rise of Skywalker. That's their Star Wars, and they're 6 years older. Plus, the older part of the fandom, whether it be individuals like myself or individuals like my father who took people like me as a kid to go see the original movie, having the episode blank title attached to it still carries weight and merit. And I think that potentially this movie that will be announced at Star Wars Celebration in Europe is going to be, maybe it's Damon Lindelof's movie, but it'll be Episode 10. It'll be Star Wars Episode 10 blank. And while it might focus on new characters and might move away from the Skywalker saga, to me, that's the most marketable thing that Disney could do. They need to have a good movie regardless, and Bob Iger knows this. So it seems to me it makes more sense to have a good Star Wars movie and make it Episode 10 than it is to have another Star Wars movie come out that doesn't seemingly have any attachment to the other films. You label it Episode 10, you know what's coming after Episode 9. That's my theory. I'm sticking to it, and I expect to have that confirmed here in a couple of weeks.
I need
Nope, not going there yet.
something.
This is where we're going.
Inside me has always been there. But now it's awake. And I need help.
I really loved this week's Mandalorian episode, and I've really been enjoying these first 3 episodes so far. If I go back and watch this episode, I will probably watch the beginning, and then I will fast forward to the end, because I don't need to see the middle portion of it again and the story of Aaliyah and Dr. Pershing again. However, I still enjoyed watching it on a first watch. It's just, and I feel like it served a very specific purpose. So, first off, let's talk about the book ending of the show. And let's talk about I'll just go in order. Let's talk about the opening of the show. The opening of the show is fantastic. Bo-Katan clearly does not want the Mandalorian to know that she saw the mythosaur. Bo-Katan, in my opinion, is now struggling with whether or not Din Djarin's the way is actually the right way. Or she's angling because she wants to get the Darksaber, she wants to restore Mandalore, she wants to be the one to do it. And maybe perhaps she's seeing her in now that she's joined with the Mandalorians group and has been accepted into their coven. I think I'm getting this. Coven or covenant? Their coven. Because she also bathed in the waters. We don't know her true motivation yet. And I'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the latter half of the episode. So clearly, she doesn't want the Mandalorian to know the full extent of what he might be a part of yet. Mandalorian's focus right now, Din Djarin's focus, is simply getting back with his people, bathing in the waters and getting back to his people and being accepted back as a Mandalorian from the Armorer. That's what his focus is. Bo-Katan, I believe, her focus is still potentially to bring about the rule of Mandalore again, and she wants to be the one to do it. So, either she is angling in sort of a Game of Thrones-esque way, and she may end up turning out to be the bad guy. I believe that, and I know that Moff Gideon is coming back. We'll talk about that in a moment, because we don't really have a villain in this yet. Or she's perhaps getting a quasi-redemption arc and may end up adopting into the culture that the Mandalorian is, because she's beginning to buy into it now, having seen the mythosaur. That being said, the other part of it was that dogfight at the beginning of the episode was fantastic. It was by far the best ship battle that they have put together in live action, in my opinion. And The Mandalorian has always delivered on that front, whether it was in Season 2, when they went down to the ice planet when the Mandalorian was being chased by the X-Wings, whether it was, and I believe this was Season 2 as well, when they had to go and raid the Imperial compound on Navarro. There was the Marauder chase through the canyon involving the TIE fighters, and the Mandalorian showed up at the end. This past last week's episode, or the episode 1 of Season 3, but this dogfight and the appearance of the TIE interceptors was just absolutely spectacular. Loved every moment of it. They're being chased down, the moves done by Bo-Katan, Mandalorian jumping out of the ship to get to his Naboo starfighter to get involved, the appearance of a lot more TIE interceptors, and then the move that Bo-Katan made when she actually turned the ship and moved one of her, I don't even know what you want to call them, wings, but she actually adjusted one of her wings to flip her ship around to take aim and face off against the approaching TIE interceptor. I've actually, as a nerd, I've got a what was it? It wasn't the Y-wing. It was the U-wing. The U-wing from Rogue One. When I've just been messing with the diecast in my hand, the wings move back. The stabilizers. The stabilizers move back. I've actually done that move just playing with it, of flipping a stabilizer out and having it, turn on a dime. It was just absolutely epic. Loved it. And if I go back and watch this episode, which I will, I'll be watching that dogfight over and over again because it was just spectacular. All right. Getting into the core of the episode, this was really an Andor-like episode in 40 minutes, okay, because it was about a 56-minute episode, where we needed to see the turn of Dr. Pershing. We needed to see that Alaya, who I never trusted from the get-go. I thought it was very telling when the episode opened that they did the flashback to showing her on Moff Gideon's ship, and having remembered her from the previous seasons on that ship and how pretty ruthless she seemed. I was convinced that throughout that entire episode she was playing Dr. Pershing, and I was absolutely right. I enjoyed the scenes on Coruscant. I thought Coruscant looked spectacular. It felt a bit like a TV show at times. I thought the compositing work that was done when they were walking around eating the glowing ice cream, which was a little strange. They needed to have conversation. They needed to have dialogue. They did a good job of handling all of that. It's just you could tell that they were on the volume when they were filming all of this. I thought the moment with the Mount Everest doing that thing with my fingers peak that they showed, in giving an idea of just how big Coruscant is and how much they built to it, where they were standing there at the highest point, where they said if you stood on this, you could see the entirety of the planet, and here you have the planet completely built around it with all of the infrastructure, was really, really cool. But ultimately, you had a story that was very similar to a story that we saw in Andor, where we saw this individual who was no longer a part of Moff Gideon and the Empire, of whatever it was, left with, wants to do something more, wants to still do his cloning, is trying to justify it in his mind, and they played him like he was a sympathetic character, but really he's kind of an evil dude still. And they needed to have this episode to establish, in my opinion, one, how Aliyah was able to get the cloning materials. I question whether or not at the end of that portion of the show, the Mind Flayer really did completely erase his mind, or if it erased his mind enough to where she'll still be able to take advantage of him for the cloning technology. But when he was giving that TED Talk to the Senate at the beginning of the episode, it gave off some really creepy vibes. He was, he told the story about how he wanted to save his mother, and there's been some silly rumors out there about how, I wonder if he's actually the secret daughter of or secret son of Padme. Give me a break. It's not it. Interesting to think about, but just not the case. But he was looking at purity and wanting to create a pure person. I think he believes his motivations are good, but it's that old adage of, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. The fact that he's been given this new lease with this amnesty program, and he's willing to go and push the limits of that and break the rules to go off and find this material and what he thinks is best, which is what the Republic is against, and for very good reason. The New Republic doesn't want to get involved in cloning. They saw what happened with the clones. It makes all the sense in the world. And then we see that Aaliyah is playing like a double agent. She's been accepted into the amnesty program. She tries to defend Dr. Pershing in telling him that he would be doing something for the Republic when really she was setting him up for the Republic and showing he was not adhering to the program. She gets the cloning material, and I'm convinced that she's getting the cloning material because she has every intent of breaking Moff Gideon out and using it to get back to what Moff Gideon was doing, which was more than likely working for the Emperor to either prolong his life or to bring about Snoke in a setup to provide more context to what we saw in the sequel trilogy. While I found that whole portion of the show to be a little dull, it was absolutely 100% necessary, and we can now dispense with it. We've got the setup now. Moff Gideon will return, and we'll get that further storyline as it relates to whatever cloning work is being done and the true motivation of that. We had always kind of just assumed that we knew what Dr. Pershing was doing. We knew that he needed the blood of Grogu for the M count, and we all assumed it was for cloning. We saw the cloning patch on his arm, but it hadn't really been laid out specifically. Now it's been laid out in detail in that TED Talk at the beginning, and now the question that I have, again, is whether or not she just wanted the material so that somebody else could continue the cloning work, or if she's wiped his mind now and she will actually use him because he still has that ability to go and clone, even though the Mind Flayer has done its damage on him. I'm kind of thinking he might be done, considering the fact that she turned the dial up to 11 on that sucker at the end of the episode. Either that or she's just an absolute sadist, which is a possibility as well. Then we get back to the story that was started at the beginning of the episode with, if you're looking at this as an Oreo cookie, the other part of the cookie, whereas the middle would have been the cream, right? We get Bo-Katan taken back to the planet where Din Djarin is accepted back into his clan, and as is Bo-Katan. Which, again, raises this question of motivation. And I don't really have a preference of which way they go on it. I think it would be interesting if Bo-Katan has nefarious intent, but we've also seen her be the good guy. I mean, it really can go either way at this point in time. I kind of like the idea of her, she had been rejecting what she was talking about, silly bedtime stories to the Mandalorian. And perhaps there's ways that they can learn from each other where he didn't know much of her ways and she didn't really believe in his ways, and perhaps they could come together in that way. And we may even be looking at sort of a triad, if you will, of Bo-Katan, Din Djarin, and Grogu as well as it relates to the mythology of Mandalore. I just really, like I said, like the way that they're setting up the story, and I'm eager to see where the rest of the season's going to go. What do you think? TalkShowNerd at gmail.com and leave a comment up on YouTube.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
All right, we got some listener feedback this week. First comes from Miranda, friend of the show, Miranda Alicia, who said, here's a theory that I have that I shared in another video just a few hours ago. Something tells me that the most dangerous antagonist for this season may not just be Moff Gideon whenever he shows up, nor do I think it will be any first signs of the First Order or whatever the officer from the New Republic is warning about. The dude with the white beard in the trailer, or even the first signs of an impending appearance from Thrawn. They're all going to become a problem later on for the galaxy. However, because we are so focused on Mandalore and the Mandalorian culture right now at this moment, I think the Armorer, or as I call her, the Viking Mandalorian, is the biggest threat right now for Din Djarin, Bo-Katan, and the Mandalorian clans as a whole. Watch out for this. All right. We can see how that plays out. I want to go back. You reminded me of something as it relates to the New Republic, and this was what I had mentioned when I was talking about that rap article, so I'm glad that Miranda actually jogged my memory on that. We had a little discussion and pause of the show as I kind of got Melinda back up to speed on where we were in the timeline. So we're 7 to 10 some odd years outside of now Return of the Jedi. So the Empire has fallen, as we saw at the end of Return of the Jedi. You have these remnants of the Empire that are still out there, way out in the unknown regions. You'll have the building up of the First Order and, of course, Exegol. We don't know exactly where Snoke is at this point in time or if he's even been created at this point in time. We know that Thrawn is out there somewhere. That'll be tackled in Ahsoka, having its ties to Rebels. So really, you kind of have this New Republic that's in sort of this peaceful moment apart from the remnants of the Empire that are still out there causing problems here and there, and then the pirating issue that we talked about earlier. What I thought was really interesting was when Dr. Pershing was done with his galactic TED Talk and he walked out and there were these group of these elitists that were standing there and they were all impressed with what he was doing and talking about and understanding, and it was really sort of boosting his ego, providing some context to his turn throughout the episode and him believing and convincing himself he was doing the right thing and continuing his cloning work. You might scratch your head and go, well, why were those individuals who are a part of the New Republic so supportive of him if it's against what the New Republic is about and they have rules against cloning? It's because those individuals were the profiteers that were benefiting from the war, and it really harkened back to Canto Bight in The Last Jedi. As a matter of fact, one of the alien creatures, sort of the big guy that was on the train, was, and I don't know if it was exactly the same character from The Last Jedi, but that creature, that alien we had seen in the Canto Bight scene featured very prominently. The individuals, the elitists that he was talking to after his speech in front of the Senate really reminded me of those individuals from the Last Jedi and Canto Bight and how they were portrayed, and that was the whole point of Canto Bight in The Last Jedi. Regardless of whether or not you like that movie or not, I happen to think it's a masterpiece. That being said, it really does, to me, add a little bit more context to, these are the worst people in the galaxy. These are the individuals who are playing both sides and are able to profit from the war that's taking place. So I really liked that aspect of the episode as well. And again, this continued sort of contextual tie-in to the sequel trilogy. All right, friend of the show, Tom, writes in. Nice show last week. Thank you. I look forward to catching up with the Bad Batch. Also, I was underwhelmed by Kenobi. I was joking with a lawyer friend of mine that there should be some hilarious in-world class action advertisements against Obi-Wan. Have you been injured or killed by Darth Vader? You may have a case against the Jedi who could have killed him twice. I was meh on the Dr. Pershing story. I think a rather dull detour. I liked the concept, but it could have been done in 7 to 8 minutes, not 40. I kept waiting for it to be done. Unfortunately, the tone was off. It felt like I was watching The Mandalorian, but it wasn't all in. What were your thoughts? Yeah, and again, I mean, I won't go over what I said before, but I also thought it was rather dull, but given the task of what they were attempting to do, if you had rushed that, I think the complaint would have been, I didn't buy the fact that Dr. Pershing turned as quick as he did. So I felt like they did a good job within that 40 minutes to show the turn of him and to get that story sort of out of the way. It's a problem, and I heard another podcast say this, and I thought the same thing. When it comes to Star Wars or just a lot of content, you deliver too much, and I'm not saying that you're saying this, Tom, I'm just saying in general. You deliver a little bit too much and people complain it's too much. You deliver less a lot of times and people can go and fill in the gaps, and it's usually of benefit. This episode being 56 minutes, I mean, it did a lot. And while that middle portion was a little bit dull, again, I think that where we ended up and the story they told was a necessary one. Tom goes on to say, I'm writing because I'm a fan of your podcast, and I also want to tell you about my book. You mentioned that there might be room for a new IP to step in as Star Wars falters a little bit. Not that you're making Star Wars shows in your backyard, but I figured, hey, you brought up the subject, so you seemed like a good guy to reach out to. Timberwolf is a book that he's written, is like Jason Bourne meets Aliens. It's like spy-fi more than sci-fi. A very damaged protagonist has to stop his former mentor from starting a disastrous war, all while dealing with a psychic alien spider that's riding along in his mind. The book was published a few years ago, but my publisher went out of business. I own the rights now and put the book out myself. He left me an audio sample, and it was very enjoyable. It has a 4.3 rating and continues to sell pretty well by word of mouth. Would love to hear what you think. Tom, I'll definitely be checking it out. And it's funny because I've come across your book before. So for those that want to go and check it out, look for Tom Julian and Timberwolf. I'm always happy to support a fellow author. Now, before I let you go, I did say I was going to talk about Bad Batch, and I haven't done that yet. I don't have a ton to say about the episode. I'm wondering where we are going with this story on Padu. It seemed like a bit of a filler story. An interesting, different type of Star Wars story in that we got almost sort of a natural disaster tale in a Clone Wars, which I thought was kind of fun. I enjoyed it for what it was. I'm always a bigger fan when we are moving towards telling, the larger stories than I am sort of these one-off stories. But I did enjoy it, and I'm curious to see where the rest of the season goes. I don't think it's an episode that I'll necessarily go and watch again. For the reasons that I mentioned, it just seemed a bit like it was a filler episode. As always, I enjoy the, Omega. Anytime that she's, got a story that she's involved in, I enjoy watching it. And I hope that they continue to tell stories of that character for a long, long time to come. As always, what do you think? I want to hear from you. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. Or leave a comment up on YouTube. That wraps up the show for this week. We'll be back again next week with my further thoughts on the next episodes of The Mandalorian and The Bad Batch. I believe that next week's episode of The Mandalorian is going to run just a little over 30 minutes, so it'll be a slightly shorter one. And I can't help but wonder, by the way, that if they actually took the bookends of this week's Mandalorian, that maybe they were supposed to be attached to a previous episode, and they didn't want to just have the story that they told to be about Dr. Pershing, so they moved it to this episode and bookended it. It was very similar to what they did with the two Mandalorian episodes that they focused on in the Book of Boba Fett. In that second episode where Din goes to see Grogu on Luke's planet, they bookended it with stories from the Mandalorian as well. So I thought the tactic worked either way. I mean, I think I would have been, I don't want to say disappointed, but it would have been a little bit of a bummer if we didn't have that raucous opening and then the last part, the third part of the episode with Din Djarin and Bo-Katan going to the planet and them both being accepted, him back into the clan and her being accepted into the clan. So I'm glad that they did that. I just wonder if they didn't do a little bit of clever splicing and those other two episodes that bookended the show weren't supposed to be attached to a different episode. But maybe we'll know some other day when we do when we get some behind the scenes stuff. All right. Again, thank you so much for checking out the show. I hope wherever you are happy, you are healthy, and you are safe. We'll talk to you again next week. Bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My nerd world.